It's all right now. You're safe here, little one. Just rest.
Can you believe? A Bigfoot could shed tears and beg humans to save its child. And the person it chose was a widow living alone in the Arkansas mountains, in a dilapidated wooden cabin. In the late summer of 1989, deep in the remote Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas, a 58-year-old widow named Loretta Halbrook lived alone in a cabin her late husband built with his bare hands. She had spent her life as a hospice nurse, easing people through their final moments. And she thought she knew grief. She thought she understood loneliness. But one evening, something shattered the silence. From the mist stepped a creature, tall, trembling, and silent. It wasn't snarling. It wasn't savage. It was a mother, and in her arms, a baby, limp and barely breathing. Loretta didn't run. Her instincts kicked in. She checked the child, deep wounds, infected, clearly caused by steel cable traps. Human traps. She brought the baby inside. That night, she worked by firelight, boiling water, applying herbs, whispering comfort. And outside, at the edge of the woods, the mother waited, motionless, watching, hoping. Over the days that followed, something unspoken began to grow. Every dawn, the mother left gifts, medicinal roots, dried moss, healing bark. And as the baby, now named Wren, began to recover, Loretta felt something she hadn't felt in years. She was needed again, but peace never lasts. Unmarked green trucks arrived. 2 men claimed to be forest officials. No badges, just new cable traps in the back. Loretta knew. They weren't rescuers. They were hunters. So she made the hardest decision of her life. Before sunrise, she wrapped Wren in a blanket and returned him to the woods. The mother was waiting. There were no words, just a look, a touch, and then they vanished into the forest. Months passed. Then, one spring morning, Wren returned, healthy, strong, standing beside his mother. He stepped forward, looked at Loretta, and made a soft, low sound, like a goodbye. When people ask Loretta if she believes in Bigfoot, she just smiles and says, "I don't believe in Bigfoot. I believe in a mother's love. And that is real." If this story touched you, I'd love to know. Where are you watching from? What's your name, dear friend? And just how far can this story travel, if we let it? Let's build a community where wonder, kindness, and Bigfoot still matter. Leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe if you believe in more than just monsters. You believe in meaning. From my heart to yours, thank you for listening. The axe came down with a thud that scattered dry bark across the forest floor. Loretta Halbrook, Retta, to the few who still called, wiped her forearm across her brow and squinted at the slant of the sun dipping behind the pines. The air was thick with the golden ache of late summer. Warm, humming. Not hot anymore, but not yet cool. That hush before fall. The kind of stillness that made even the cicadas sound distant. She bent to stack the split logs against the old wall of the woodshed, her back stiff, fingers rough with sap. Her husband had built that shed 30 years ago, just a few weeks after they bought this patch of land on the far side of the Ouachita Ridge. Every notch in the wood, every rusted hinge, still held his touch. Even now. Especially now. Dale had swung the hammer with the quiet pride of a man who never needed to raise his voice. He'd chosen cedar for the siding. "It'll outlast us both," he'd said. He was half right. Inside the cabin, the kettle began to rattle on the stove. Retta moved slow, the way people do when there's no one left to wait on them. She folded her hands around the chipped ceramic mug, sipped the weak tea, and sat in the rocking chair by the screen door. Her joints ached, but not in any urgent way. That's the funny thing about grief. It doesn't stab like it used to. It settles. It sets like cement. The chair creaked beneath her as she leaned forward. eyes tracing the edge of the tree line. Dale used to joke that the forest was her church. She never argued. Some Sundays she still stood on the porch with her hands wrapped around that mug, whispering her own kind of prayer to the wind and the leaves and whatever else might be listening. Not God, necessarily. Just whatever was out there, watching. Or not. It had been 5 years since he passed. Not suddenly, not tragically. Just eventually, like everything else. One day he was trimming the blackberry vines behind the outhouse, and the next he was in bed with a cough that wouldn't go, the kind of sickness that sneaks in polite and never leaves. She remembered the sound of it more than anything, the slow rasp, the catch in his chest at night. That and the way his hand always found hers in the dark, like he couldn't sleep unless she was tethered nearby. Even when the pain came, he never cried out. Dale Halbrook didn't believe in drama, just silence and motion. Until there was none left. Retta didn't cry much after. Not really. Tears weren't useful. She stacked firewood, canned beans, replaced the screen on the back door. She told herself she was fine, not happy, not sad, just surviving. That was enough, and she never bothered with the talk folks told in town. About the sounds in the woods, about tall shadows and howls that weren't coyotes. The gas station boy once told her a story about a giant, hair-covered thing with hands like a man and a face almost human. She'd snorted into her tobacco tin. Folks make up monsters when they're afraid of being alone, she'd said. But not everything unknown has to be scary. It was close to sundown now. That soft hour where every leaf caught the last of the light and glowed like stained glass. The cicadas had quieted. The frogs weren't ready to sing yet. Retta rocked slowly, letting the last heat of the day touch her cheeks. A thin ribbon of steam curled from her mug. And then, somewhere beyond the thicket, a sound rose up. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an owl. It was a cry, a strange, fractured thing, wet at the edges, wavering, low but high at the end, like something caught between two kinds of pain. She froze. The cup stayed balanced in her hand, but her body stilled as if the sound had tied a string to her spine. Her eyes scanned the trees beyond the clearing. No movement. Not yet. But something shifted. She felt it before she saw it. That primal thread pulling behind the ribs. That animal knowing. She stood, slow, set the mug on the railing, stepped forward, boots pressing soft into the pine needles. The cry came again, closer now, but not urgent, not wild, just sad. The fog was coming in early that night. It rolled off the ravine like a low tide, hugging the ground in smoky fingers. She took one more step. Then she saw it. The shape emerged from the mist, not lumbering, not aggressive. Just there, like it had always been. Like the forest itself had exhaled and given form to its sorrow. She blinked once, twice. It was a figure, towering, covered in a thick layer of brown-gray hair matted by sweat and dust. Shoulders broad, knees slightly bent, arms wrapped around something smaller, something limp, and shaking. Retta didn't move. The creature stepped once into the clearing, fog trailing behind it like a cape. It didn't roar, didn't raise its arms. It stood in the golden light like something carved from dusk, and it wept. The sound wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was grief, raw, heavy, familiar. Retta couldn't breathe, not from fear, but from knowing. The mother, because there was no doubt now that it was a mother, clutched a smaller body against her chest. A youngling, child-sized, covered in the same coarse fur, but trembling, slack in its limbs. Retta's hand moved to her chest without thinking. The creature took a step toward the porch, then another. It didn't meet her eyes at first. It stared at the door, at the roofline, at the rocking chair. It seemed to recognize something, or maybe remember it. Then it looked directly at Retta, and in that 1 second, the whole world went still. The eyes weren't monstrous. They were tired, pleading, intelligent. Retta didn't flinch. She'd seen pain like that before. In hospital rooms, in the eyes of mothers holding fevered children, in the mirror, once or twice. The creature knelt, carefully, with reverence. Then, with a movement so slow it felt sacred, it laid the child down at the edge of the porch, just shy of the step. The small body stirred weakly. A wheeze, a twitch of fingers. Retta's heart was thundering now. She stepped forward, every muscle taut, but her face soft. The creature locked eyes with her again, then it backed away. 1 step, then 2, into the mist. And it was gone. Retta stood there, staring down at the figure on the ground. The baby. No, not baby. Older than that. Maybe 5. Maybe 7. Hard to tell. Its chest rose and fell shallowly. There was a raw wound across its side, crusted with dirt and something else. Black, slick, unnatural. She knelt beside it, palms hovering over its body. There, just near the ribs, an indentation. Circular, torn, twisted. The kind of injury she'd seen once in a logging camp. From wire. Thick metal cable. Retta's throat clenched. She reached out, touched the creature's brow. Burning. It whimpered, but didn't pull away. She gathered it in her arms, careful of the wound. It was heavier than it looked, but she carried it like she'd done it before. Like instinct had taken over. Like this was the most natural thing in the world. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and old wool. She laid the child, no, Wren, she would call it Wren later, on the cot beside the stove, pulled a quilt over its shaking frame, checked the fire, added a log. Outside, the fog thickened. The light dimmed. The woods held their breath. Retta stood there, hands pressed to her apron, listening. The cry was gone. Silence had returned, but something in her had shifted, as if all the years of quiet grief had led to this moment, as if the forest had finally answered back. She turned to the cot, watched the creature breathe, listened to the faint rattle in its chest. Then, without meaning to, without ceremony or fanfare, she whispered into the hush of her cabin. "I'm here." The words surprised her. She hadn't said them in years, but they felt right. Outside, somewhere beyond the mist, a shape waited. A mother who had risked everything and trusted a stranger. Retta pulled the chair close to the cot, sat, reached for the towel, dipped it in water. She had work to do, and somehow, for the first time in a very long time, she was needed again. The rain came late. Not a soft drizzle like most southern showers, but a steady downpour that darkened the porch planks and filled the night with a hush of falling water. The mountains disappeared behind veils of mist. Every tree looked closer than it should, every sound sharper in the wet hush. Inside the cabin, the fire cracked low and stubborn, not quite keeping up with the damp cold seeping through the old floorboards. Retta moved quickly, not because she was afraid. She hadn't truly feared anything since Dale passed, but because something small and fragile was fighting for breath in the cot by the stove, and her hands remembered what it meant to matter. She lit the second lamp, the older one with the green glass base, and poured a pot of rainwater into the kettle. Her breath showed in the air when she exhaled. The stove had gone cold while she'd stood frozen earlier, watching that mother disappear into the fog, leaving behind something she couldn't carry any farther. And now that something, this child thing, this half-human, half-wild creature, lay burning up and shivering under an old quilt made of flannel shirts and denim patches stitched years ago. Retta crouched beside the cot and touched its forehead again. Still burning. The skin beneath the fur was hot and damp, but the breathing had steadied just enough for her to know there was still time. Not much, but enough. She moved on muscle memory, pulled the tin basin from the shelf, filled it from the steaming kettle, ripped the oldest cotton sheet into strips with the strength of someone who'd once done this nightly. Mixed the dried goldenrod with yarrow, a pinch of crushed willow bark, and that dark salve Dale had made years ago from spruce sap and bear grease. It wasn't science, but it worked when it needed to. The wound looked worse in the lamplight. In the space between its ribs and hip, something metal had torn through the hide and muscle. A raw, angry ring of tissue, blackened around the edges. Not clean, not random. Something man-made. She cleaned it carefully, whispering not words, but breath. Not prayers, just rhythm. She'd done this before, long ago, when the world was smaller and filled with cuts, burns, broken arms. The little ones always knew when a hand was safe. They didn't need language. Just quiet. Just warmth. The child, Wren, her heart had already started to call it, twitched once, then stilled. Its fingers curled against the edge of the quilt. A breath caught. Retta paused. The eye opened. Just one, sluggish and fevered, but focused. It found her face and didn't flinch. The look lasted only a second, but it was enough to freeze her breath. It wasn't just pain in that gaze. It was recognition, as if something behind those eyes knew what it meant to be cared for, as if even now, even after whatever terror had chased it here, it still believed in the possibility of help. Retta sat back for a moment, chest tight. The storm rattled the windows, and a branch scratched along the side of the house like a memory trying to claw its way in. She added another log to the fire and blocked the draft with a folded wool blanket. The wind shifted. The night deepened. Time passed in pieces. She gave it willow tea in small sips, wrapped in warm cloth. Every so often, the child would shiver, then calm. Once, just after midnight, it whimpered something close to a word. Not one she understood, but a sound shaped like need. Retta didn't speak. She only touched its hand. Outside, the rain grew heavier. The smell of wet pine drifted through the seams in the window frames. She glanced out toward the edge of the trees, but saw nothing. No movement, no figure. But she felt it. That presence still lingered. Not gone, just waiting. And then, hours later, when the fire was dim and the room felt more like a memory than a home, she noticed something. The creature stirred again in sleep, and beneath the wound, in the deepest part of the torn muscle, something caught the light. She leaned closer, threaded the tweezers between the folds of skin. The metal clicked softly as it met something buried. She tugged gently. The object came loose, slick and blackened. A small, sheared-off cable, no more than 3 inches long, frayed at one end. The edges were sharp, too sharp, designed to grip. Retta held it up, staring. She'd seen traps before, snares meant for deer, for boar. But this was different. New, not rustic, not old. The realization settled like cold ash. She wrapped the fragment in cloth and tucked it into her apron pocket. The creature stirred again, eyes fluttering open. Retta offered a small sip of water. It drank without protest, fingers weak but reaching. For one fragile second, those wide, glassy eyes looked at her like a child would a mother. Then it closed them again and slept. She stayed up the rest of the night. Twice, she checked the edge of the porch. The rain had washed away the footprints, but the shape in her memory held strong. The height of the mother, the bowed shoulders, the way her eyes had pleaded without begging. There had been dignity in the way she left, not desperation. Choice. Near dawn, the fire died again. Retta stood, moved to fetch more wood. Her joints ached with the kind of tired that had nothing to do with age. She opened the door and paused. There, just inside the porch rail, was a fresh piece of firewood. Dry. Whole. Placed deliberately in the gap where wind always seeped in. She stared at it. It hadn't been there earlier. And no one else knew about that draft but Dale. She knelt, touched the bark, still warm from a hand, a large hand. The air around her shifted, not with fear, but something quieter. Reverence. Like the forest itself had leaned in closer to listen. She brought the log inside, added it to the stove. It caught quickly, flames dancing brighter than before. Wren stirred in the cot and exhaled something close to peace. Retta sat beside him, brushing damp hair away from his brow. She didn't cry. She just whispered into the stillness, barely loud enough to reach the corners of the room. "I'm doing it again, Dale." Her voice cracked, but the words stayed steady. "Taking care of something that can't speak, can't ask, but still needs." She pressed a palm to the creature's chest. Its heart beat slow, steady, and she knew it would live. Maybe not without scars, maybe not without fear, but it would live. Outside, the storm began to break. The sky lightened to a pale gray. The trees dripped with morning. And far beyond the clearing, just before the first birds began to sing, a shape sat quiet beneath a wide-limbed hickory, unmoving, waiting. And that shape would stay there, watching, through the dawn, through the rain, as long as it took. Retta never looked away from the child again. Not once. Not even when the light returned and the cabin no longer needed the lamps. Not even when the hush of the forest felt like something deeper than silence. Not even when she realized that, for the first time in years, she wasn't alone in the world anymore. The first cold of fall showed up quiet, like someone slipping into church late. No announcement. Just there. The air had a different weight to it that morning, clearer, cleaner, with a breath of something brittle in the wind that made Retta pull her cardigan tighter as she stepped out onto the porch. Mist still clung to the pines beyond the clearing, but it wasn't the humid summer kind. This mist held secrets. It felt like it had purpose. She stood barefoot on the worn plank floor, steaming mug in her hands, staring out across the grass wet with dew, still flattened from last night's rain. The child, Wren, was still asleep inside, breathing easier now, no fever, no trembling. The bandage she'd wrapped across his ribs had held, and she'd boiled new strips of muslin just in case. But the bleeding had stopped. The wound looked cleaner, less angry. That alone felt like a win. Still, the worry sat in her chest like a stone that wouldn't roll away. Then she saw it. At first she thought it was a pile of debris, wind-blown twigs maybe, or one of those little heaps of moss that raccoons sometimes built and picked apart. But the shape was too neat, too centered. Something had placed it, not tossed, not dropped, arranged. She stepped off the porch, boots crunching soft over the damp ground. A few feet from the steps, just past where the grass met the first patch of pine needles, lay a bundle. Small, compact, almost artful. A twist of dried roots. A length of moss braided with something finer, almost like rabbit fur. 3 pieces of curled bark, stripped smooth and tied together with a length of woven vine. She crouched slowly, not touching it at first, just looking. It wasn't trash, and it wasn't random. It was a gift, not the kind that meant ownership. This was different. Something had been given to her, not in exchange, but in trust. She reached down, palms trembling more than she wanted to admit, and picked it up. The roots smelled sharp, medicinal. The moss was still damp. The bark, oak, maybe hickory, had been scraped and rubbed until it shone faintly in the morning light. Retta stared at the bundle like it had just whispered something, like it had a voice only she could hear. Then she carried it inside and placed it gently on the table beside the oil lamp. She didn't speak. There wasn't a word that felt right. Wren woke late, eyes bleary, chest rising and falling with effort, but not as labored as before. He didn't speak, hadn't said a word since the night he arrived, but he looked at her now with something closer to steadiness. Not ease, but calm. His fingers gripped the edge of the quilt, and when she offered him a warm spoonful of thick oat gruel, he accepted it without flinching. She didn't ask him questions. She just sat, stirred the fire, dipped a cloth in water, watched him blink slow and heavy, the way children do when their bodies are still working too hard. By noon she had company. Pearl Sutter pulled up in a rust-red Dodge with a coffee can full of cuttings and a stubborn look that didn't fade, even when Retta told her she was fine. Pearl had been stubborn her whole life, and retirement hadn't softened her. If anything, losing 2 husbands and surviving breast cancer had made her twice as sharp. She still grew every herb you could think of in the raised beds behind her trailer and swore by tree bark before any hospital-made cure. Pearl didn't come inside. She didn't have to. She took one look at the bundle on the table through the screen and set the coffee can down on the porch with a grunt. "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered, nodding toward the gift. "That's not just for decoration, you know." Retta didn't blink. "I figured." Pearl leaned closer, squinting. "Golden thread moss, bloodroot, witch hazel bark, polished clean. That's pain medicine, fever reducer. Whoever left that knows their business." Retta let the words settle. It wasn't a person. Pearl's eyebrows didn't twitch. "Didn't say it was." They stood in silence for a while, the air thick with the smell of pine and wood smoke. Pearl finally turned to leave, but stopped at the steps. "Be careful," she said, voice lower now. "Gifts like that, they don't come from instinct. They come from learning. That means somebody taught them, and if someone taught them, that means they've been watching." Retta nodded. She already knew. The rest of the day passed with that thought looping in the back of her mind. That someone, or something, had seen enough of her to believe she was worth trusting, that her hands were safe, that her porch was a place you could leave your child and not come back to a grave. That night, just before the light died, she went out to gather kindling near the back of the cabin. She didn't often go behind it, not because of fear, but because the land there dipped down toward the holler and always held more shadows than the front side. The wind moved different there. She stepped carefully, following the same worn path Dale had once carved with his boots and machete, and paused near the woodpile. Then she saw it. Boot prints. Not hers, not Dale's, new ones. She crouched, tracing the edge with her finger. They were shallow, but the toe angle was sharp. Hiking boots, maybe steel-toed. Longer stride than hers, heavier weight. They were fresh. She scanned the tree line, heartbeat rising, no sound, no birds. Even the crickets felt distant. She straightened, slowly, and moved back toward the porch with the bundle of wood under one arm, and the unsettling knowledge that her solitude wasn't so solitary anymore. When she stepped inside, Wren was sitting upright, eyes fixed on the window near the stove. He wasn't shaking, but his hands were clenched tight around the quilt. She said his name. Quiet. He looked at her, then, slowly, raised one finger to his lips and pointed toward the window again. She crossed the room, eased the curtain aside. Nothing but trees and rain-slicked leaves. No movement, but something had been there. She could feel it in her bones. That night, after Wren drifted back to sleep, she stayed by the fire long after the logs had turned to coals. She kept her ears sharp, the kettle warm, her hands busy. Just past midnight, another bundle appeared on the porch. No footsteps, no knock. She found it at dawn, like before, set in the exact same spot. But this time, it wasn't medicine. It was a rabbit. Small, freshly killed. No blood. Laid on a square of woven grass, its legs curled under like it had just fallen asleep. But its neck bore a mark, deep and cruel. A loop scar. The kind wire leaves behind. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She picked it up gently, turned it over in her hands, and set it next to the first gift. There was no misunderstanding this one. This wasn't healing. This was a warning. Later that afternoon, when the rain cleared and the wind brought that high whistle from the ridge, Wren sat up on the floor, far from the window, and pressed his small hand over the wound beneath his ribs. Not from pain, but from instinct. As if something had stirred in the woods. As if he'd learned, too, what danger smells like. Retta stood by the sink, staring out at the yard and the trees beyond. her fists clenched around a wet dish rag. She didn't know who had walked behind her cabin, or what they were looking for. But she knew this much: they weren't the only ones watching anymore, and they weren't the only ones who could leave messages. Under the thin gold light of mid-autumn, the world looked too peaceful to be hiding anything cruel. The trees above Retta's cabin burned soft with amber and rust, their leaves whispering down slow, one at a time, like someone shaking out old memories. That time of year always made her feel like the forest was exhaling. But this year, there was something else in that breath, something she couldn't ignore anymore. Retta crouched beside the split-rail fence, eyes narrowed, hand hovering over a patch of disturbed soil near the edge of the clearing. The ground wasn't soft, but something had pressed into it deep enough to leave a faint groove. Cable wire. She knew that shape. She'd pulled one just like it from Wren's side. Same tension, same signature bite. The sun warmed her shoulders, but her spine felt cold. She stood and scanned the trees again, slower this time. The woods had never been empty. She understood that now. But lately it felt like there were two kinds of watchers. One with eyes like Wren's mother, the other with something else behind the silence. She followed the trail downhill past the rock that marked the old creek bed, a place she and Dale used to gather kindling in spring when the ground was soft and the water still high. But today it was the crows that led her. 3 of them, clustered around a young pine, their calls too sharp, too urgent. She pushed through the brush and found it. A set of posts. Just 2 for now. Sharpened at the ends. Driven into the earth in a straight line, not natural. Newly cut, still clean. Next to them, a loop of thick black cord, coiled tight and gleaming with factory oil. No scent of rust or age. Not something left by a hunter. Something placed. Recently. She crouched again, this time not bothering to hide her breath. Whoever was doing this had been close. Maybe still was. A rustle behind her. She rose, spun fast, but it was only wind through the understory. Her hands were shaking as she wiped her palms on her jeans. Retta didn't consider herself the kind to scare easily, but something about that cord made her feel small, like someone out there wasn't just hunting. They were planning, quietly, deliberately, as if this wasn't their first time. She took the long way home, backtracking along the ridge before cutting across the gravel turnoff near Mavis's place. The leaves crunched beneath her boots, and squirrels darted across the path. But her focus stayed sharp. She didn't want to go back to the cabin just yet, not with that image stuck in her head. So she knocked on Mavis's door with the back of her hand, hoping for some kind of normal. The woman answered in an apron, flour on her cheeks, and a rolling pin in hand. Well, if it isn't the mountain ghost. Retta didn't smile. Mavis studied her. You look like someone just dug up a secret. Retta tilted her head. You still got that nephew who works for the sheriff? Landry? Mavis stepped back, waved her in. He's been filling in since Deputy Collin broke his leg. Sit down, I'll call him. By the time the smell of biscuits filled the kitchen, Retta was already explaining, slow, measured, about the traps, about Wren, about the wire. She didn't name what he was. She didn't have to. Not to Mavis. Big? The woman asked, keeping her voice low, more curious than afraid. Big enough, Retta answered. When Landry showed up, he parked his cruiser a few feet down the hill like he already knew not to be seen. He was in his 30s, sharp jaw, quiet voice, polite in the way some men are when they don't want to disappoint their mothers. Miss Halbrook, he greeted, eyes steady but warm. Auntie said you found something near your line. She led him back that same afternoon. Didn't soften a word, didn't over-explain, just showed him. Landry crouched and studied the cabled post without speaking. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out a small flashlight, scanning the area around the base of the stake. His face didn't change, but Retta caught the quick breath he took when he saw what she saw. This is the same style used in transport traps, he said finally, voice careful. For holding something alive, not killing it. She didn't answer. He stood up and turned slowly, scanning the tree line. "Have you noticed anything else?" he asked. Retta hesitated, then nodded. "Animals have been acting strange. Wren—" She stopped herself. "He gets quiet when it rains. Like he hears something coming before I do." Landry nodded once, then paused. "Can I ask who Wren is?" Retta didn't blink. "Somebody I'm protecting." He didn't push. Back at the cabin, Wren was curled under the quilt, arms tucked close. He didn't stir when she entered, just shifted slightly like he'd been listening from behind sleep. Landry glanced once toward the cot, then back to her. He didn't ask to get closer. Just said, "Do you mind if I swing by again?" "Maybe off duty," she agreed without smiling. He left after checking the trail behind the house. Said he'd file a note, but nothing official. Said these things sometimes disappeared in paperwork. Said he'd keep it quiet. That night the wind turned. Wren woke just after midnight and sat up straight in the dark, eyes wide, shoulders trembling. He didn't make a sound, but Retta saw the way he looked toward the trees. She lit the lamp and waited. Minutes passed. The cabin creaked. A pine cone fell outside, then nothing, then quiet, then something more. From the porch, she stepped barefoot into the night. The air smelled wrong, like sap and rubber, and something sharp, like metal. She stood still. That's when she saw it. Up near the ridge. A figure, not walking, not running, just standing, listening. It was Wren's mother, her silhouette enormous, unmoving, head turned toward something in the distance, not toward the cabin, past it. Then she shifted, took a single step back, tilted her head, slow and deliberate. Retta followed her gaze. Nothing. But she knew. She knew what it meant when a creature built for silence went still like that. There was danger, close, moving, and not from the woods. She whispered something she didn't remember deciding to say. "I'm still with you." In the morning, the smell lingered. Even after the wind changed, even after the sun rose. Wren didn't eat. He sat with his back to the door and watched the cracks in the wall like they meant something. Retta didn't ask what he saw. She already knew. And she knew, too, that whatever came next, she'd need to decide before someone else did. Because this wasn't just about hiding anymore. Someone had started a hunt, and someone else had left a child on her porch like a prayer. The balance couldn't hold forever. Under a sky the color of ash, the truck came. No sound at first. Just the way shadows fell too stiff across the gravel, and the birds stopped chirping all at once, like someone had flipped the forest switch to off. Retta was snapping beans by the open window when the low rumble reached her chest before her ears, vibrating through the floorboards like a bad thought. She set the bowl down and moved to the screen door without rushing, but everything inside her had already stiffened. The truck rolled into view at the edge of the clearing like it didn't need to explain itself. Big, green, unmarked. The color of Forest Service vehicles, but too clean, too wrong. The way it idled, just past the oak Dale had planted 30 years ago, said it wasn't lost. It was waiting. 2 men stepped out, not uniforms, no badges, just canvas jackets, faded denim, leather boots. One was tall and stringy, his eyes half-lidded like a man who always thought he was 2 steps ahead. The other was broader, heavier, with hands that hung too loose at his sides, like he didn't care who saw what he might do with them. Retta stepped onto the porch, closing the screen behind her slow. Wren stayed inside. She didn't have to look to know. The boy had learned silence better than most grown men ever could. The taller one smiled, an empty thing, and took off his cap as he approached. "Ma'am," he said, like the word was on loan. "Hope we're not interruptin'. Name's Warren Slade. My buddy here's Troy Belling. We're with—" "You're not with forestry," Retta said flat. That knocked his smile off center just a little, but he recovered quick. "Well now, not officially. Contracted. Subdivision. State-funded. Kind of off the books." She didn't blink. Troy shifted behind him, arms crossed, scanning the cabin, the yard, the trees. Not even pretending to hide it. Warren rubbed his neck like they were just old neighbors dropping by. We've been running a few surveys in the hills, tracking some unusual signs. Had a report of something. Large, injured, maybe dangerous. This area came up flagged. Thought we'd check in, make sure you weren't seeing anything out of place. I see all kinds of things, Retta said. Doesn't make them your business. Warren chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Sure, of course. Thing is, we came across some interesting tracks not too far from here. Broken branches, makeshift shelter signs, odd prints. A lot of folks round these parts say it could be bear. Or worse. Worse? She echoed, letting the word hang like smoke. He shrugged, playing humble. Just trying to keep folks safe, ma'am. Not looking to stir trouble. Retta studied the truck. The rear window was tinted, too dark for standard issue, and something heavy shifted in the bed when the breeze rocked the frame. She spotted it then, coiled beside a gas canister and a broken crate. New cable line, thick and gleaming. Her stomach turned. You'll want to turn that rig around before the storm rolls in, she said. Road washes out bad by dusk. Troy grunted something under his breath, and Warren turned, almost casually, to inspect the porch rail. He leaned in, ran his hand along the wood. Then he stopped, plucked a coarse strand of hair caught in the grain. Held it up. Retta said nothing. Warren turned it in the light like it meant something. Then dropped it, slow and quiet, onto the porch floor. Say, he murmured, you ever have trouble with wildlife? Big wildlife? I got a dog once in a while, she said. He smiled again. Sure, I bet you do. They left without pushing further, but not like they'd been dismissed. Like they'd done what they came to do. Left a message. Retta stood on the porch long after the truck disappeared behind the pines. The beans sat forgotten. Wren hadn't moved. She could feel the stillness behind the door like another presence. Later, when the light started slipping gold through the trees, she found it. Under the porch, where Dale used to stack the kindling neat as books, was a mark. Faint, but fresh. A small cluster of pebbles, arranged in a line. One pointing toward the back trail, the others fanned like a compass. A trail sign, subtle, meant to be found again. Retta dropped to her knees and swept the dirt clean with her hand. Her fingers trembled as they passed over the edges of boot treads. Deep ones, broad. More than one set. She stayed there a long time, crouched in the dust and pine needles, listening to the woods as if they'd answer. Inside, Wren shifted. No sound, but she felt it. The air changed with him. That night, when the fire burned low and the moon pulled shadows sharp against the windows, Retta didn't sleep. She sat in Dale's old chair, facing the door, the same blanket across her knees. The old shotgun leaned just beside her, unloaded, but the weight of it was enough. Wren breathed soft beneath the quilts, but she knew he felt it too. The way children know when something isn't right, even if the room is warm and the danger hasn't stepped inside yet. She watched the woods past midnight, heart too still, mind moving too fast. When it came again, it didn't come loud, just a quiet hush, just the weight of someone else's plan unfolding, step by step, like it had already been written, and the knowing sank deep. For the first time since he'd been left in her arms, she was afraid for him, not as something strange, but as a child. And in her chest, something old and buried lit up again like dry kindling in a sudden wind. Something fierce, protective, something she hadn't felt since Dale was sick, and she'd sat by the bed night after night whispering things he couldn't hear, but she said anyway because love doesn't end just because someone is dying. She stood. She looked out into the trees, and in the silence between the rustling leaves, she spoke without raising her voice. I won't let them take him. The forest didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Not anymore. The woods held their breath that morning. Not in fear, but in waiting. There'd been no new gifts left on the porch, no fresh signs by the fence, no returning figures in the mist. Just quiet, thick and full, like the trees themselves were bracing for something they couldn't stop. The sky had dropped into a soft slate color, and a fine frost lingered in the weeds. the kind that didn't melt until the sun was well above the ridge. Winter hadn't arrived yet, but its hands had touched the earth, and Retta felt it down to the marrow. She moved around the cabin with a rhythm that wasn't quite hers. Too focused, too spare, like she'd shed everything unnecessary overnight. The stove burned low, the kettle stayed on a slow boil, and her boots waited by the door like they already knew where she was headed. Wren sat on the floor near the hearth, his back to the wall, one hand resting on the ragged quilt. He wasn't sick anymore, not in the way he'd been, but something in his eyes had changed. He looked at the fire like it was trying to tell him something. Not a warning, not a threat, just time. Retta sat beside him, a canvas bag between her knees. Inside, a few folded towels, a jar of salve, 2 apples, a small tin of dried meat. Enough to carry, but not enough to weigh them down. He didn't speak. He never had. But when she opened the bag, his head turned toward her, and she saw it. The soft widening of his eyes, the catch of his breath. Understanding. "I think it's time," she said. Voice steady, low. Wren blinked once, then nodded. The sun hadn't fully risen when they stepped off the porch. The frost crunched beneath their feet in tiny protests. Retta walked slow, letting Wren set the pace. He stayed close, but not clinging. His steps were sure. Not fast, but steady, like he knew where they were going, even if he didn't know the name of it. The trail they took wasn't a real trail, not one worn by boots or mapped by rangers. But Retta had followed it once before, back when she'd seen the cable buried near the tree line and realized the world didn't care about mystery unless it could be chained. Now she followed it again, this time with purpose. Half a mile in, they paused to rest near a boulder slick with moss and shadow. Wren crouched low, hands pressed to the dirt. He sniffed the air, brow furrowing. Retta didn't speak. She just watched him, heart tight. That's when she heard it, the soft crunch of tires behind them. Not on gravel, on packed dirt. Closer than it should have been. She turned fast. 2 fresh tire tracks etched across the damp earth behind them, weaving through trees that should have been too narrow to drive. She hadn't heard the engine. That meant the vehicle had stopped, or gone silent. Wren looked up at her, mouth parting. His shoulders tightened, and without being told, he took her hand. They moved faster now, not running, but urgent. The woods grew thicker, the air colder. Somewhere behind them, the sound of something being stepped on, a twig, a branch, snapped, then vanished. When they reached the clearing, Retta froze. She hadn't known, but somehow she'd expected it. The Bigfoot mother was already there, standing still at the far side of the glade, framed by the trunks of 2 ancient trees, her form part of the forest itself. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't crouched. She was waiting, like Retta. Like Wren. She stepped forward once, then paused. Her eyes, dark and old and filled with something too deep to name, looked past Retta and found the boy. He didn't move. Then, quiet as breath, he let go of Retta's hand, stepped forward, and made a sound. A low, small call, like a hum, but shaped like a word that didn't belong to any human tongue. The mother answered. One short exhale, barely audible, but it reached him. Wren moved faster now, not toward her, toward Retta. He pressed his face to her stomach, wrapped his arms around her waist, and stood there, shaking. Not from fear, from something harder, from the kind of goodbye that only creatures who learn to love in silence can understand. Retta closed her arms around him, one hand to the back of his head. Her voice, when it came, wasn't broken. It was full. "You go, baby, go!" He pulled away, blinking hard, lips pressed tight. Then he turned and walked toward her. The Bigfoot mother knelt to meet him, arms open. He collapsed into them without a sound. And then, before she turned to leave, she looked back, not at her child, at Retta, and crossed the space between them. For a long moment, the two stood close enough to touch, but they didn't. Then, Slowly, the creature lifted one arm. Not to threaten, not to shield, just to place her large, dirt-worn hand against Retta's shoulder. A touch full of weight, gratitude, history, and something else. Permission. She dropped her hand, stepped back, and disappeared into the trees. The boy held close to her chest, his eyes peeking back once through the shadows. Retta didn't move until the last sound of footsteps vanished. Didn't speak, didn't cry. She stood in the clearing alone, the smell of earth and pine heavy in her lungs. Her arms still wrapped around the air where he had been. The wind blew then, harder than before, bending the branches with a soft groan. She closed her eyes and let it pass through her. The last thing she said that morning wasn't a whisper. It was a breath, spoken like a truth she finally allowed herself to say out loud. "Goodbye, my son." Then she turned and walked back toward the cabin, one step at a time. And the forest, this time, didn't feel quite so still. The cabin no longer held the smell of medicine. No faint whimpers at night. No child's shape curled beneath the quilt. Just the creak of wood settling against winter's first chill, the low hum of the stove, and the stillness of a place that had returned to one body's breath. It should have felt like peace, but it didn't. Retta moved slower now. Not because of age, not because of sadness, because every part of her understood that something was circling back, something unfinished. She woke early, not from a dream, from a pressure, like the forest had stepped closer overnight. The silence was different, not heavy, tight. Crows didn't call, the wind didn't carry. It just held. When the knock came, it wasn't on the door. It was on her land. The rumble of tires chewed up the morning quiet. Too close, too fast. Not the truck from before. This one was louder, meaner, like it didn't care who saw or heard it now. Retta stood in the doorway as the engine cut off. The same green truck, but it wasn't pretending anymore. Warren Slade stepped out first, sunglasses even though the sky was clouded and gray. Troy followed. He wasn't looking around like before. He walked straight to the porch, boots dirty, jaw set, like he'd already made up his mind what he'd find. Behind them came two more men, not dressed like rangers, not dressed like contractors, dressed like men who didn't want names remembered. Warren lifted a paper, waved it without reading. "Got a warrant this time, Miss Halbrook. Not for you, for the premises." Retta didn't answer. He stepped past her. Inside, the men moved without hesitation. One headed to the back bedroom. One crouched by the woodpile near the stove. Troy hovered by the kitchen, scanning shelves like he was measuring her life in jars. "What are you hoping to find?" she asked finally. Warren smiled without teeth. "Evidence. Something that shouldn't be here. Or someone." She didn't blink. "You're too late." Troy looked up. "Too late for what?" She didn't say. But they noticed. They noticed the empty cot, the missing quilt, the absence of small things, a tin cup that once sat near the fire, the second set of footprints by the back door long since washed away. Still, they searched. Warren opened her pantry like he owned it. Troy knocked on the walls as if the cabin was hiding a secret passage. They checked beneath the porch. They pried up 2 loose floorboards, but they found nothing, until one of them stepped out into the side clearing and stopped. There, in the soft mud, was a footprint. Too big for a man, but not fresh. The silence cracked then. Troy called out, low and sharp. "You saw it!" Warren walked over, crouched, ran his finger along the edge of the print. He looked back at her, slow. "You've been lying." She met his eyes. "About what?" He didn't answer, but something in his face changed. Like he knew there was no story he could drag from her that wouldn't feel like defeat. Landry showed up 30 minutes later, not in uniform. Just his truck and his tired eyes and the weight of something heavy in his jaw. He got out slow. No lights, no sirens. Just presence. "You didn't call," he said quietly, standing next to her on the porch. "I didn't have to," she said. He looked out toward the men still combing through the brush, eyes narrowing. "They told dispatch you were harboring something, said they had credible leads." Retta didn't speak. Her hands were wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. Landry watched them work. Watched how they pulled at tree limbs, kicked at rotted logs, stomped through places where no boot had reason to go. Then he stepped down off the porch, walked to the men, and stood in front of the truck. "You're not authorized for this kind of search," he said plainly. Warren blinked. "We have federal direction." Landry didn't move. "Show it to me." Troy opened the door like he might, then stopped, because there was nothing. Not really. Just noise and excuses and maybe some name in some office somewhere that was counting on no one out here asking too many questions. Warren muttered something under his breath, turned back toward the woods, but the shift had already happened. Landry didn't move. "You'll leave now," he said. Warren laughed once, bitter. "You gonna stop us?" Landry tilted his head. "Maybe not, but this road only goes one way, and if you want to make it back out, I suggest you make friends with the people who live here." Retta hadn't asked him to say it. She hadn't said a word since he arrived. But the air felt different now. The truck doors slammed, the tires bit into the ground, and they left. Not fast, not in victory, just gone. Landry stood watching until the tail lights vanished behind the bend. Then he walked back, eyes still scanning the edges of the trees. "You did something," he said quietly. "Didn't you?" Retta looked up at the branches overhead. A leaf twisted loose, spun slowly to the ground. "They asked me to protect something," she said. "So I did." Landry didn't ask who, didn't ask what, just nodded once, like some old part of him had been waiting for this story all his life and finally realized it didn't belong to words. That night the woods stayed quiet. No engines, no boots, no flashlights cutting through the dark. Just wind, just firelight. And then, just past midnight, something appeared on the porch. Not a gift this time. Not food. Not a warning. It was a branch, thick, broken, stripped of bark, and tucked inside the notch where lightning had split it once was a single oak leaf, curled inward, its stem driven into the wood like a signal. Retta opened the door, looked down, touched it with the back of her fingers, then looked up at the tree line. She didn't need to see anyone to know. The forest had spoken, and it had chosen a side. The truck never came back. Not after Landry stood between them and the forest. Not after the branches were rearranged on her porch like a final line drawn. The green truck, the men with their clipped tones and hands too confident, they vanished the same way they'd arrived. Sudden, unwanted, unrooted. And when they were gone, it was like the ground itself smoothed over their tracks, like the land had chosen to forget them, or maybe just bury them where they couldn't crawl back up. Retta didn't tell anyone. No one asked. In town, people greeted her with the same soft respect they always had. A nod, a hand on the arm. A bag left outside her truck when she came in for feed. Cornmeal, dried apples, old-fashioned molasses wrapped in brown paper. Kindness with no signature. The kind that didn't demand thanks. Winter came. Real winter. With black skies and breath that hovered in the kitchen like a ghost. She chopped wood every 2 days now. Not because she needed to, she had plenty stacked, but because the rhythm helped. One strike, one breath, one reason to keep her hands strong. The house held the quiet well. It didn't echo, just carried memory in its walls, softened by time. Then the first gift came back. She found it on a Monday, after a light snowfall that barely stuck to the earth. Set against the bottom stair like it belonged there all along. A cluster of moss, bundled into a small braid. Clean, neat, familiar. Not medicine, not a warning, just presence. She picked it up gently, turned it in her hand. A single red berry had been tucked inside the braid, bright as blood, sweet as a promise. It didn't say hello, but it didn't have to. Every week after that, a new gift appeared, sometimes bark, sometimes a carved bit of wood shaped like a leaf. Once, a small, smooth stone hollowed at the center like a bowl. It had sat in the middle of her palm, catching the light, as if meant to hold something important, something small, like memory. No one ever came with the gifts. No shadows at the tree line, no silhouettes behind the fog. But she felt them, the way birds went still when they arrived. The way the air warmed by 1 degree the moment before she stepped outside, as if someone was still watching, still remembering, still grateful. Landry stopped by twice that winter, once to bring her a bag of dried herbs from his sister, once just to say hi. He didn't ask about the boy. She didn't bring him up. But before he left, he paused by her porch and looked out toward the ridge. "You still seeing signs?" She tilted her head. "Of what?" He smiled just a little. "Whatever it was that made you start stacking firewood tighter and carrying a loaded thermos every time you step outside." She smiled back. "Signs come in quiet ways." He nodded, resting a hand on the rail. "They ever need a friend? You let me know." She watched him drive away until the road swallowed the dust. Spring cracked the world open again, not with fanfare, with slow, steady breath. Water ran thinner beneath the creek bed. Fat robins returned to the berry bushes. The mornings came earlier. Retta opened the windows again. She cleaned the cabin not because it needed it, but because it felt like honoring something that had lived there with her. Something she'd let go. It happened in late May, early light. Soft clouds hanging low. The kind of morning that made everything feel held in place just long enough to matter. She stepped out with her coffee. The steps creaked under her boots. And there, near the edge of the woods, not close, not far, stood Wren, older now, not by years, but by something deeper, taller, shoulders squared a little more. His fur had darkened in places, grown thicker around the neck and arms. But the eyes hadn't changed. He didn't approach, just stood. Retta didn't move. Then, from behind him, the mother emerged. Even after all this time, her form still bent the trees around her presence. Like the forest remembered how to move when she did. She placed a hand gently on Wren's back. He looked up at her once, then stepped forward. 3 steps, then 1 more. He stopped just outside the fence, reached into the leather pouch strung across his chest, and pulled out something small, round, light-colored. He knelt, set it down in the grass, then stood, and left. No wave, no sound, just the memory of his breath, visible for 1 brief second in the cool morning air. Retta walked toward the object. Slowly. It was a carving, a piece of pale wood, whittled into the shape of a cabin. Not detailed, not precise, but unmistakable. The roof slanted. A notch at the side for the porch, a dot at the door, and next to it, smaller, tucked close, another shape. A child, barely formed, just enough to know. She picked it up, held it in both hands like it might slip through her fingers if she didn't anchor it, then looked back at the woods. Empty now, still, but not silent. She turned toward the cabin, wood in hand, and spoke aloud for the first time in a long time, not to the trees, not to herself, but to whatever might still be listening. "People ask me if I believe in Bigfoot." She walked up the steps, set the carving on the windowsill beside Dale's old compass. She smiled, soft and tired and full. "I don't." She poured the last of her coffee into her mug. "I believe in mothers." She sipped. "Set it down." "And that's real enough for me." The wind passed through the open door, carried her words out to where the trees stood listening. And somewhere beyond, something heard. Some stories don't end with answers. They end with silence. A kind of sacred quiet, where truth doesn't need to be proven, only felt. This was never about proving the existence of something strange in the woods. It was about how people, forgotten people, quiet people, choose to respond when the world asks them to protect what can't speak. It's about the weight of choosing compassion over control. About seeing the sacred in something that others call wild, and realizing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay. Stay when no one else will. Care when it isn't safe. Believe, not in legends, but in the bond between living things that have nothing left except each other. There is a kind of strength that doesn't roar. It doesn't come with fanfare. It shows up quietly, carrying firewood, boiling water, watching the tree line. That strength lives in patience, in resilience, in the small choice to care over and over again, even when no one is watching. And maybe that's the lesson buried here. That we don't need proof to love. That family isn't always built by blood or biology, but by trust, by presence, by the simple radical act of showing up with your whole heart for someone or something that the rest of the world has already written off. In a time when so much around us feels disconnected, this story reminds us that some truths live off the grid, deep in the woods, beneath bark and bone and silence, the kind you don't stumble across. You're chosen to witness them, and once you do, you are never quite the same again. Maybe the creatures we fear most are not monsters, but mirrors. Maybe the question isn't, do they exist? But, would we know how to respond if they reached out to us first? And maybe, just maybe, this world still holds quiet corners of magic, where love is wordless and care is instinct, and the wilderness isn't something to conquer, but to listen to. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, made you think, or simply reminded you that kindness still matters, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your reflections might just be the spark that lights someone else's belief. And if you'd like more stories like this, tender, raw, human stories wrapped in the hush of the unknown, make sure to subscribe and follow our channel. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories don't come from far away. They live just past the edge of the known. And all it takes to find them is a heart willing to listen.